how would you recommend they apply your book, read your book?
Oh, that's a good question. So I had a mentor for a while, and he always used to say that the way that you absorb information is in layers. So as you've already said, and I completely agree, you read it once, you absorb a percentage of it. The more you familiarize yourself with the content, the more you're going to layer the understanding. So, for example, there are books, probably about 5 or 6 books that I've read at least a dozen times. Yeah, at least a dozen times. And it sounds crazy, and these are big, weighty books. And why have I done that? Because I think the books in themselves are a meditation for me, and the information they impart are incredibly important. As for my book, I've said read it and reread it. There's even a section that says to go back and reread the whole section, because I believe that the level of awareness that we derive from what we read changes. Because it's a bit like pitch slap. We explain to people we only want to hear it, or we want to hear it for the first time fresh, so that we get the high notes, those things that immediately stand out, right? They're the obvious things to fix. But if you and I were to revisit the same pitch a dozen times, each different viewing or repetition would allow us to appreciate the subtler points, the things that are more that are easier to miss on first blush, because they're overshadowed by the higher peaks of the problems or the things that need changing. And I think the same happens with reading. When you engage with material, you layer your understanding. And I honestly learned stuff. In those books I read multiple times, I learned stuff every time I revisited the material. Something that previously I heard a dozen times it didn't mean a great deal suddenly went, I get that. That completely changes. So with my material, I tend to say read it cover to cover, go through the exercises, but go back and just open the book randomly. Let the universe determine where you're going to start reading and see what comes up. Revisit a statement or a passage 2 or 3 times. If it suddenly strikes you that you can't remember the key points of what you just read, go and reread it. To that end, I quite like the author Noam Chomsky. If you're familiar with him, he's a professor of neurolinguistics. He's an incredibly intelligent guy. He writes prolifically, but his writing is very dense. And I remember spending a month reading one chapter because it was just couldn't hold it in my head at the time. But I kept reading it, and just so I became more familiar with what he was. Just a bit thick, but the point is you layer that awareness, and it becomes encoded. So with books like Eckhart Tolle, who as a person, as a spiritual person, what have you, has had a significant impact to me, I pretty much know what he's saying in the different chapters of his book, what he's talking about. So for my own benefit, not to quote people because that's really pretentious, but I rely on those remembrances, those passages to put me back on track sometimes. So I think it's incredibly important that you don't believe you can read a book once and take away its value. It's just, to me, I don't think that's true. It's a very long way of explaining that. You can edit that one out in the room.
No, I want you al natural. So as a summary of the summary, no. So you recommend, of course, reading it once. You're a big fan of audio, right?
Yeah,
Audio books.
Most of my materials absorbed that way, yeah.
Okay, so you're a fan of reading it once, and then doing the exercises, and then once in a while, depends on the person, every week, every 2 weeks.
I think if you revisit that material multiple times in the first 1 or 2 weeks, you'll retain a lot more. I think the statistics are not great for retention on the first blush. So if you revisit it 3 or 4 times, 5 times in the first week or 10 days, you're going to probably retain it. So when I say revisit it, not the entire book, but the chapter, just revisit state, revisit intention, revisit belief in those sections. If you
Yeah.
can come and quote to your in your mind what's being said, then you know you started to absorb it. Yeah.